докладчику Николас Леви. «Создавая советский горизонт. Строительство московских высоток и трансформация советского городского пространства».
Становится ярче и ярче.
Может быть, цвет увеличить? На горизонталь. Нормально?
Так, сначала хочу сказать спасибо организаторам и всем участникам конференции за шанс, как только начинающий аспирант представить хоть эту маленькую часть своей работы. Доклад вложен в сети на Dropbox. Это является часть моего магистратурного тезиса. Is that a word? Магистратурный?
Да.
Whatever. Написано еще в университете Чикаго. Я пытался здесь сосредоточиться на те части этого проекта, которые именно об обсуждении советского содержания в процессе строительства. И дальше насчет того, что я вот, не имел достаточно времени перевести доклад, я буду просто перейти на английском. Извините всем, которым придется надеть наушники. Но я готов после своего доклада, может, ответить на вопросы и на английском, и на русском. Только не могу на немецком. Maybe через славных переводчиков. So my paper, which I'm going to skip around some on, or not so much skip around, but skip some parts, I will follow it largely. So like Professor Plumper, I will hope that since it's late in the day and people are tired, that you didn't actually read it. I started this particular part, and maybe at the end I'll go back and talk about what else is in the paper, just so we don't end up with questions about why didn't you write about this? There's a chance maybe I did. Again, this was an MA project, so there's a lot that I started learning about and didn't get to cover. But as a starting point for this paper, I was actually looking back on the construction process, which was 1947 and 1953 of the Vysotki in Moscow, from the perspective of post-Stalin culture. And I was actually, just by chance in the process of writing this paper, watching the film «Я шагаю по Москве». It's a 1963 film. And the whole opening credits with the sort of famous song coming on is shot from and looking at с разными ракурсами the various Vysotki as they sit around Moscow. And it does a really good job of placemaking, right? It takes these shots and it sort of gives you this immediate sense of where you are. And really the only role that ends up playing in the film is that мы, как главные герои этой истории, приехали именно в Москву, столицу Советского Союза. So creating an architectural ensemble as visual shorthand for the Soviet capital was certainly a goal of Stalin-era planners, but it was a loaded task that had been already the subject of heated debate since the revolution's earliest hours. And we talked about some of the sort of conflicts. In fact, I think Jan and I quote from the same Kaganovich speech from 1931 in our papers. So I'm not going to talk about that too much. It just seems to me like I think it seems to Jan that, especially given the patently industrial and urban orientation of Soviet visions of modernity, the cityscape was a pretty important thing. And this Kaganovich moment in 1931 is really a moment where the Bolshevik regime has decided that these creative interpretations, or maybe многозначные interpretations, are falling short of consensus, and the Communist Party makes a move to rein it in. So actually what I quoted from Kaganovich was this quote in which he is talking about what makes Soviet cities socialist. And it's kind of this cop-out justification, right? It's, well, we had a revolution, did you guys forget about that? So that by their nature, these cities are already socialist. What this ends up meaning in practice for planners and architects in the Soviet Union is that it's pretty clear that the Soviet is going to be determined from on high, but it doesn't necessarily fill that with any particular content. And since we're trying to fill this idea of the Soviet with some content here, I thought I would go further into the debates that actually lead to the building of it and see what, if anything, we get. I think it's important to point out that before the construction of the Vysotny doma, skyscrapers, right, in some of the architecture debates that again were mentioned by Jan in the early 30s, which I'm not going to talk about too much here, but vertical forms, and even the word nevoskrob in Russian, were largely associated in Soviet visual culture, films, plakati, as inextricably linked to the West, to the United States, and a distinctly, even oppressively so in a lot of cases, a capitalist urban model. So I just was going to throw up here a couple pictures that were also in my paper, just to give you an idea of just sort of the vertical thrust of architecture, and these are both from 1932, but this actually continues later into the 30s in films by Medvedkin and stuff. You see skyscrapers are generally the setting for whatever's bad that's going on in the capitalist world. And yeah, I mean, I'm not going to talk about these too much. Again, check out my paper. I can send you the longer version. But as you can see here, that this is the broad front is going to smash these high-rise buildings. Various nationalities of poster-carrying workers are sort of overshadowed by capitalist skyscrapers in the Dolgorukov one. So there was this model, right? And so when we start to come down to the actual construction of first Sovietov and the Vysotny doma after the war, you end up with a situation where a lot of the planners and architects who end up being involved in this, if you go back and look at their record, what did one guy say about this? You take someone like Boris Yofan, who was the architect, or the lead architect among several, who won the Dvorets Sovetov competition in the 30s. He was originally on the team of architects for MGU and was sort of the it architect in 1947 when they launched this program. They contradict themselves, right? Back in the mid-30s in an article on contemporary American and European design, Yofan was saying that the skyscraper itself, by the nature of its form, comprised all the contradictions of the capitalist system. And then later he's calling high-rise buildings the latest word in architecture, advancing with great urgency to search for a Soviet architectural style. But I guess what I'm seeing in this is not so much a full-fledged reversal in Soviet aesthetic attitudes, because there's still this negative counter-image of Western urban development. The issue of contrasting capitalist and socialist verticals is something that's highlighted even in the Постановление Совета Министров, which I actually found I happen to have in this thing that came with me, so I can probably translate the quotes. I can for once do a quote in Russian. But they were saying, in the original Stalin-signed Council of Ministers resolution, 5 minutes? Oh, is that already 5? I'll try and speed up. That they needed to be оригинальные, увязанные с исторически сложившейся архитектурой города, но не должны повторять ни в коем случае образцы известных за границей многоэтажных зданий. So there's this opposition being created, and it's something that I followed through in the paper. Again, I'm not going to get through it all, it looks like, but so if you have a chance to read it. It's something that stays activated throughout this period, which is obviously a period that comprises the Zhdanoshina, the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, where there's actually quite a lot of, this is pretty loaded in a field that's kind of at the edge of art and science, right? Architecture and construction. There's quite a lot of dispute that I think shows that, aside from just generating propagandistic statements like whatever we build is socialist, or our buildings are social because of the nature of economic and property relations in the Soviet Union, that they actually were trying to sort out something like the Soviet. So I end up talking about meetings at Volks, where they're having an American architecture exhibition, and saying that, you know, American architecture is dead, real architecture is only alive here where it's not, where individuation is not lost behind advertising forms. When Zhdanoshina starts picking up steam, you end up having really long, boring documents that I found in the Architects Union archives, where people are going back and trying to denounce people who probably have jobs that they want, the people reading their articles from wartime, writing about British, American, French architecture, calling this низкопоклонностью к Западу. And then at the same time, you have the main Architectural Affairs Committee, Комитет по делам архитектуры при Совете министров, using connections to Beria himself to write a laundry list, longer than this table, to Amtorg in the United States. It basically catalogs and stuff from Western companies that are involved in building skyscrapers that they want to steal. So to try and get to some of these, some of the conclusions that I try to make about what ends up being Soviet, about the skyscrapers themselves. And I have way more here than I can possibly begin to show. When they start to get down to actually debating the projects themselves, it's a lot of ex post facto. The buildings in 1949 are rolled out in an article of the main architecture periodical, Architectura и строительство, which I actually happen to have a copy of here if anybody wants to look at it. And everybody gets the Stalin Prize. Basically, all that's been done is groundbreaking and a little bit of planning, a little bit of moving around the resources. But that doesn't stop people from fighting afterwards about how these buildings are going to be finished and whether or not they count as Soviet. So I have some interesting documents from, again, architect union meetings where it's said that these buildings, and you guys, everybody's seen these buildings. I think, do I have some here? Yeah, just for pretty pictures for people to look at. And you guys can sort of be the judge for yourself. It starts in one of these debates at the theory and criticism section as saying these buildings have to be, someone uses the phrase «широкое, открытое, народное здание». This is talking about the one on Smolenskaya Ploshchad, which is now the Foreign Ministry of the Russian Federation. And then I love this quote by someone who ends up getting enormous round of applause as annotated in the documents. A guy, Kostya Zhus, says, "We're not supposed to resemble the Americans. We still haven't achieved that. Why did the authors decide that such a building could only be accomplished with vertical elements when it's already 125 meters tall? That's already 60 times greater than human height, so why stretch it out like Italian macaroni and think that it's beautiful? So when they tell me that the building expresses some kind of democracy I can't even understand, there's not even bourgeois democracy here. Тут нет даже никакой буржуазной демократии." So even through the building process, there's this un-Soviet, Soviet dichotomy going on last minute, which I find somewhat convincingly, in my conclusion, people like Lev Rudnev, who ended up replacing Yofan and being the head designer for MGU, who also built later the Palace of Science and Culture in Warsaw. Obviously, he had the biggest plощадka, right? Everybody's been to MGU and it stands on a ton of line, but he said specifically, skyscrapers in America, as in anti-Soviet skyscrapers, stand shoulder to shoulder in a scramble for money like teeth in a decaying mouth, while ours are set apart by their placement in open space, surrounded by air, not pressing against each other. And if you look at the way that the buildings stand around Moscow, I have a map here later, obviously people are probably familiar with them. I had a couple pictures here and wanted to talk about how later as this sort of ensemble-ное мышление, which is a big thing in Soviet architecture, which I generally think is Soviet and not American or Western. Whether you like, for example, Novy Arbat and the way it sits in, they are able to build these things into what they call an ensemble. And I end with a quote, actually, kind of in opposition to a lot of the ideas that we have. I hear a lot in the literature about the Vysotny Dama, created by Khrushchev in his memoirs, where he says, Stalin had some sort of like inferiority complex vis-a-vis the West. What if they come to Moscow after we've won this great war and see that we have no buildings? So this is the sort of Stalin says when. He also then goes on to say, as for his part, which by the way doesn't at all take into account that he was head of the Moscow Party for this, sent a lot of the materials from his old connections in Ukraine, after denouncing these излишества like the Vysotny Dama, he says in his memoirs, the whole thing was pretty stupid if you ask me. You'd never find capitalists building skyscrapers like ours. As for the architectural style of the buildings, I don't have a single good word for it. So the subjectivity of personal taste aside, Khrushchev may have inadvertently touched on one of the key symbolic elements that led many of his fellow citizens, by the time of this Я шагаю по Москве introduction in 1963, to an essentially opposing conclusion, that the very otherness and divergence of the Vysotki from capitalist skyscrapers helped make them legible as part of a uniquely Soviet cityscape. So, thank you, and thanks to the переводчики, and sorry for running over.
Okay, we have one question right there. Marie? Okay. Natalia.
All right. Thank you so much, Nick, for a very interesting presentation. And I have just a quick commentary.
Natalia, your mic is on.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Nick, so again, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. And just a brief comment. I think that it's a very interesting problem of relationship between the Soviet project and American project. And I think that it's a little bit oversimplification to assume that the Soviets disliked all things American. And I think that there is an interesting book about the American Hollywood movies, which were widely popular in the 1920s. So I just want to kind of to inspire you to problematize this relationship between the Soviet and American. And I think that Orlando Figes in his works, he writes a lot about the importance of mass culture. And he makes very interesting arguments that actually the skillful use of mass culture by Bolsheviks during the Civil War, for example, was, interestingly enough, one of the reasons why the Bolsheviks were able to win this war, because they use this colorful posters, they use this language of propaganda, which was very clear for the mass reader. So again, I just want you to think about this paradoxical love-hatred relationship between Soviet Union and America. And don't forget that a lot of revolutionaries, like Trotsky, for example, they spent considerable amount of time in the U.S. at some moment of their time.
Right, as did a lot of the architects involved in this. And if I guess problematizing is sort of a broad topic. It might have to do with what I read here and don't. But ultimately, I do think that there's a lot of talk about direct borrowing, and my emphasis here, if it came out as saying that I think these are basically American buildings transposed in Moscow, I'm essentially trying to say the opposite. So it may have to do with what I got to and not, it might have to do with my presentation, but there's a lot of back and forth about it. This is trying to just be a snapshot, but again, it's part of the bigger. But I absolutely, that's one of the big concerns of the project, and I appreciate the comments.
I have a question to you. Unfortunately, I haven't read your paper in the Dropbox, so forgive me if you have written these things in the text. Were there any mentions about your resemblance between this Vysotki and the Kremlin towers? Because I suppose this idea could possibly afford the nationalization of the whole project. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely is the answer to that, and one of the reasons I didn't include it in this paper and specifically left it out when talking about it, Jan was just speaking about the 800-year anniversary of Moscow, which was in 1947, the year that these were announced in January. I don't think I ended up getting any dates in there, which was a bit of a failure. But certainly in the context of that, I think a lot of people interpreted that as the part that I read from the original Постановление about увязанные с исторически сложившейся архитектурой города. A lot of people thought about the Kremlin towers, also the колокольня в Кремле. So yeah, definitely it was this time of the sort of revival of great Russian culture within the Soviet paradigm, and some people were trying to write to that. Other people were less interested in that.
Благодарю вас за очень интересный доклад. Я хотел обратить ваше внимание на важный временной лаг, гэп. Дело в том, что высотные здания, построенные в Москве в описанный вами период, имели несколько довольно ясных образцов, не просто небоскребов как таковых, но, например, Empire State Building, который был построен за 30 лет до этого. Значит, но у всех высотных, практически у всех высотных домов в Москве есть одно принципиальное отличие как от Empire State Building, так и от всех вообще небоскребов американских, а именно огромное массивное основание, напоминающее каждый из этих домов в памятник на постаменте или в Кремлевскую башню на стене. И это впоследствии было опознано многими как специфическая черта, если можно так выразиться, советского имперского стиля возведения небоскребов, потому что вы мельком показали Дом культуры и техники в Варшаве, построенный в форме советской высотки, где в Варшаве он до сих пор опознается как своего рода послание из России, как некоторый империалистический жест, вынужденно сохранившийся в центре Варшавы, потому что разобрать его нельзя и девать уже некуда. Вот. И там происходит сейчас очень интересный и сложный процесс ресемантизации этой конструкции, который специально занимается один американский планист сейчас. Вот. Поэтому тут есть некоторая важная специфическая архитектурная черта этих высоток.
Ну, спасибо за комментарий. Да, вот опять же, вот я несколько не успел прочитать, но именно про сходство. Actually, I'm just going to respond in English if that's faster, or just be faster. About the likeness to buildings like the Wrigley Building in Chicago. Not so much Empire State, but there's a building down by City Hall that's from because Empire State really is from the 30s. It's not 30 years older than these buildings. Yeah, there's a lot of discussion of that in the literature, and in fact, you know, my broader project or broader paper is trying to say that there's something more important going on here about Soviet effort to change urban space in Moscow than just taking 30-year-old obrazцы from America and slapping them around Moscow. And I was definitely, right around the time I was talking to Rudnev, working on MGU, getting to this part where they're always talking about how these buildings with the sort of pyramid shape and these big wings and stuff like that, they organize the residential quarter, they create good and hygienic cultural conditions for the life of the population, they grow out organically. They love the word organic in this time period of Moscow's built-in... Huh? Да, вот и у меня тоже цитата по первому была, но тоже не успел прочитать.
Nicholas, first of all, thank you for your broad presentation. I would suggest here to make kind of step back to the discussions of the mid-20s and the very start of 30s when it was somehow questioned the very possibility of having such a kind of thing as a socialist aesthetic. Because I mean, there's debates between so-called urbanists and des-urbanists. So to my mind, actually, before doing any kind of research regarding the so-called skyscrapers or Vysotki in Moscow, first of all, we need to explain how it came out that finally it was accepted that it is skyscrapers that should form the skyline of a socialist city, not the say natural environment forests with more or less one or two-story buildings. That's the first point. The second one is about possible connections in terms of architectural history. It's quite obvious that there is lots of influences and impacts between American and Russian architecture, and probably you don't know that the main architect of VDNH, Oltarzhevsky, had a special professional experience in the United States.
In Chicago.
And yes, right, in Chicago. But it would be probably more interesting if you would compare the Soviet case not only with the American one, but also with French or influence and European influence in general, and French especially, since Le Corbusier was extremely popular and influential among all Soviet architects in the 20s and in the very beginning of 30s, and probably the Americanization of skyscrapers architecture as somehow the result of a choice between two very different conceptions of what a skyscraper should be, namely the conception which was elaborated by Le Corbusier and in his plan for Paris, and the conception which we have in case of Manhattan, New York City, or Chicago, because those are two very different understandings of what a skyscraper should be, how it can be located in a particular site, and what kind of environment we need to have around this building.
Okay, yeah, I think we're running out of time. Thank you, Nick, so much. And так, и сейчас у нас следующий докладчик Людмила Кузнецова. И, тема выступления «Пространство советского курорта. Свобода или контроль».